Desperation makes you do stupid things. For me, it was applying for a job at the morgue. I figured cleaning up after the dead couldn't be worse than cleaning up after my last boss, who was alive and far grosser. Plus, the ad said minimal supervision, which translated to no one breathing down your neck. Win-win, right? The first few weeks weren't so bad. Sure, the place smelled like a mix of bleach and regret, but I kept my headphones on and scrubbed counters like my life depended on it. Which, in hindsight, it probably did. The senior staff worked during the day, so I rarely saw anyone except the dead. And they were great company. Never complained, never gossiped. My kind of co-workers. But then things started getting weird. One night, I was cleaning the embalming room when I noticed a body bag left out on the table. It was unzipped just enough for me to see the pale, waxy face inside. Now, I don't know much about morgue protocol, but I'm pretty sure leaving Steve half unzipped wasn't in the handbook. Stranger still, the body wasn't logged in the intake book. Either someone was cutting corners, or Steve had taken the express train to Purgatory without a ticket. I decided to let it go because, well, I liked having a job. But then I started noticing more oddities. Body bags showing up with no tags, doors left unlocked, and once, a pair of latex gloves on the floor with something red smeared across them. And not the strawberry jam, kind of red. And then there was the van. It showed up around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was mopping the hallway near the back entrance when I heard an engine. Peeking out the window, I saw a plain, unmarked van roll up to the loading dock. Two men in black jackets got out and wheeled in a body bag. At first, I thought, maybe Uber launched a new service for the deceased? But then I realized they weren't coming through the front intake. Nope, they went straight for the freezer room. By the third night, the van was starting to feel like the world's creepiest Amazon Prime delivery service. And what really unnerved me was that the senior staff, people who were never supposed to work nights, were always there when it arrived. I don't know what they were doing in there, but judging by the fact that no one ever made eye contact with me during the day, I assumed it wasn't bake sales. I decided to investigate because, clearly, I have no survival instincts. After finishing my shift, I hid in the supply closet near the freezer room, leaving the door cracked just enough to see into the hallway. Around 1:30 a.m., the van rolled up. This time, I saw my boss, the director, get out, looking like he was late for a funeral, which I guess wasn't entirely inaccurate. The director and the two men wheeled a body bag into the embalming room instead of the freezer. My heart started doing its best impression of a techno beat as I crept closer. Peeking through the window, I saw them unzip the bag, revealing a man's body, his chest already sliced open like a biology class project. One of the men handed the director a scalpel, and he began removing organs with the same efficiency I used to carve a Thanksgiving turkey. "You've got 10 minutes, one of the men said. The buyer's waiting. That's when it hit me. I wasn't working at a morgue. I was working at a butcher shop for human parts. I backed away from the window, trying not to make a sound, but of course, fate had other plans. My foot caught the edge of a mop bucket, and it tipped over with a crash that might as well have been a gunshot. The room went silent. I didn't wait to see who came out. I bolted for the front door, grabbing my bag from the locker room on the way. As I reached my car, I heard the back door slam open. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw the two men standing there, staring at me. And here's where I made my best life decision. I hit the gas and didn't stop until I was 3 towns over. The next morning, I handed in my resignation. The director didn't even blink, just smiled and said, "Good luck." That smile haunts me more than anything else. A few years later, I saw his face on the news. Turns out, the morgue had been part of an organ trafficking ring, selling body parts to buyers across the country. Some of the donors weren't even dead when they arrived. The director served 6 months before being released on a technicality, because apparently, even the justice system has a sense of humor. I try not to think about it too much, but sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear the rumble of an engine outside my window, and for a split second, I swear I see that unmarked van. I laugh it off, of course, but I've been keeping a mop bucket by the door, just in case. The family arrived just before closing, their presence heavy and unwelcome. There were 3 of them, a man, a woman, and a younger man who barely spoke. They demanded to see a body, their voices sharp, their eyes darting around the room as if expecting a fight. "We need him released tonight," the man said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He slid a hastily prepared death certificate across the counter, avoiding my gaze. It was signed, stamped, and utterly unconvincing. "We'll need more information about the circumstances of the death," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It wasn't uncommon for grieving families to act out, but this felt different. Edged, dangerous. The woman leaned in, her voice a low hiss. "You don't need to know anything, just do your job." I glanced at the younger man, hoping for some sign of reason, but he stared at the floor, his jaw clenched tight. My instincts screamed at me to stand firm, to follow protocol. But their presence felt suffocating, like the air itself was conspiring against me. Reluctantly, I stalled them with a fabricated delay, pretending to need more verification before the body could be released. They didn't like it, but eventually left, muttering darkly about coming back for what was theirs. Hours later, as I was finishing up, I heard the sound of breaking glass from the back entrance. My heart raced as I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy metal clipboard, and crept toward the noise. The storage room door was ajar, the lock hanging uselessly from its frame. Inside, the shelves were in disarray, the carefully cataloged files scattered like leaves. But it was the empty gurney in the corner that made my blood run cold. The body in question, the one I'd refused to release, was gone. Something on the floor caught my eye. A folded piece of paper tucked neatly under the overturned gurney. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The message was short, written in a spiky, hurried hand. "Stay out of our business." I wanted to call the police, but what could I say? That a shady family had broken into the morgue and stolen a body? That they'd left a vaguely threatening note? I shoved the paper into my pocket and finished the shift in a daze, my every nerve on edge. The next morning, I found myself scanning the news, half expecting, or maybe hoping, for some explanation. Days turned into weeks, and just when I began convincing myself to forget the whole ordeal, the headlines appeared. Mass grave discovered on rural property. The aerial footage showed a sprawling field littered with makeshift graves, each marked only by disturbed earth. Authorities reported dozens of bodies, their deaths shrouded in mystery. My stomach twisted as the property's owners were revealed. The same family that had stood in front of me that night, demanding their loved one. I don't work at the morgue anymore. I'd like to say it's because of better opportunities or a change of heart, but the truth is, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd barely escaped something far darker than I could comprehend. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that note and the threat it carried. I think about how close I came to staying in their business, and I wonder, if I had, would I have been just another unmarked grave in that field? It was supposed to be an ordinary night shift at the morgue, the kind where the hours stretched long and the silence wrapped around you like a second skin. But that night, things felt off from the moment I arrived. The senior staff were nowhere to be found. No calls, no texts, just an empty office and a message scribbled hastily on the whiteboard. "You're covering tonight." I wasn't thrilled about working alone, but it wasn't the first time. The job was simple enough. Log the bodies, prep them for storage, and lock up. By midnight, I had settled into a routine, filing paperwork and ignoring the eerie hum of the building's old ventilation system. That's when the knock came. It wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the morgue, it might as well have been a gunshot. I froze, pen hovering above the logbook. Deliveries didn't usually happen this late. I approached the rear entrance cautiously, the overhead light flickering as I unlocked the door. A man stood there, wearing a dark coat that seemed to absorb the light. He was tall, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. Behind him was a gurney with a covered body. No ambulance, no transport van, just him. "This needs to go in storage," he said, his voice flat, almost mechanical. He didn't offer paperwork or an explanation. "When?" I hesitated. He added, "You don't need to know where this came from." Something about him made my skin crawl. His hands were clasped around the gurney's handle, and that's when I noticed it. Blood. Fresh, dark blood dripping from his fingers, pooling onto the floor. I opened my mouth to ask a question. I'm not even sure what, but the look he gave me stopped the words in my throat. "Sign for it," he said, shoving a clipboard toward me. The pen attached was smeared with the same crimson streaks. My hand shook as I scribbled my name. He turned without another word, leaving the gurney in the doorway. The wheels squeaked as I pulled it inside, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. Once the door was locked, I took a deep breath and uncovered the body. The sheet slid off, revealing a man's face, pale and frozen in a grimace of terror. His clothes were torn, his skin marred by deep scratches and bruises. I swallowed hard and reached for the logbook, trying to focus on protocol. But when I checked the body for identification, I found none. No wallet, no tag, nothing. Just an empty void where answers should have been. The night dragged on. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, and the hum of the ventilation grew louder, almost like whispers. By 3 a.m., I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I went back to the storage room to double-check the body, hoping for some clue that might explain the night's events. The gurney was empty. I stared, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The restraints were undone, the sheet crumpled on the floor. The logbook fell from my hands as a noise behind me made my blood run cold. The soft, deliberate creak of a shoe against the tile. I turned slowly, my breath hitching. The man from the gurney stood in the doorway, his eyes wide and unblinking, his face twisted in that same expression of terror. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but all that came out was a guttural, choking sound. Before I could move, he lunged at me. I stumbled back, tripping over the logbook and falling hard onto the cold floor. By the time I scrambled to my feet, he was gone. The hallway was empty, the door swinging shut as if pushed by an unseen hand. I didn't finish the shift. I grabbed my things and ran, leaving the morgue's lights burning behind me. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But every so often, I think back to that night, to the knock at the door, to the blood-stained hands, to the body that vanished without a trace. And I wonder, did I let something in that night, or did it never really leave? When I first started working at the morgue, I thought the job was simple. Prepare the dead, show respect, and leave the rest to the paperwork. It was quiet work, lonely but straightforward. Or so I believed. That changed when the boss asked me to handle what he called special clients. "These are priority cases," he said one day, handing me a file with nothing but a tag number and a directive to work fast. "Clean them up thoroughly, and I mean thoroughly." His emphasis on the last word made my stomach churn, though I couldn't say why at the time. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. I followed orders, washing, embalming, and dressing the bodies. But over time, small details began to bother me. Jewelry and personal effects were always missing, but that wasn't entirely uncommon. What made my skin crawl were the alterations. Fingernails clipped to the quick, tattoos meticulously removed, teeth extracted. It was as though someone was erasing every trace of who these people were. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. One night, curiosity got the better of me. After hours, I stayed behind under the pretense of finishing up paperwork. When the mortuary lights dimmed and the hum of the cooling units filled the air, I crept into the restricted storage area. The first drawer I opened nearly made me vomit. The body inside was missing its hands entirely, the stumps crudely stitched. Another had its entire jaw removed. My hands shook as I closed the drawer and moved to the next. The scene was the same. Bodies mutilated in ways that made no sense for any legitimate purpose. I was about to leave when I heard voices echoing down the corridor. Panicked, I slipped into a supply closet, leaving the door cracked just enough to see out. My boss entered with two men in suits, their faces obscured by shadows. They rolled in a covered gurney and began speaking in hushed tones. "This one's clean?" one of the men asked, his voice cold and businesslike. "Perfectly clean," my boss replied. "No identifiers, no complications." The men inspected the body, lifting the sheet to reveal a man's corpse, pale and featureless. Even his fingerprints had been burned away. One of the men handed my boss an envelope thick with cash. "Pleasure doing business," the man said, shaking my boss's hand. The realization hit me like a freight train. They weren't just erasing identities, they were selling them. The dead were being turned into ghosts, their names and histories wiped clean for criminals to adopt. I barely made it out that night, my heart pounding so loud I thought they'd hear it. The next day, I handed in my resignation, citing personal reasons. My boss didn't seem surprised. He just smiled that cold, calculating smile and said, "Good luck out there." Weeks later, I saw his face on the news. He'd been arrested, though not for what I'd witnessed. Officially, it was tax fraud. The headline mentioned nothing about the mutilated bodies or the sales of stolen identities. I wanted to come forward, but I knew better. People like him had connections, ones that didn't leave loose ends. Now, every time I see an unfamiliar face in a crowd or hear about a crime committed by someone with no past, I wonder, are they walking around with someone else's life stitched onto them? And how many more bodies will it take before someone finally puts a stop to it? There was always something unsettling about the morgue storage room. The fluorescent lights hummed too loudly, the air hung heavy with a metallic chill, and the unclaimed bodies seemed to linger longer than they should. At first, I told myself it was none of my business. But when unclaimed bodies started disappearing from the storage logs without explanation, my curiosity got the better of me. I started keeping track, making quiet notes in my phone. A body brought in on a Tuesday would be gone by Friday. No transfer paperwork, no sign-out records, nothing. When I brought it up casually to the supervisor, they gave me a look that sent a shiver down my spine. "You're paid to prep and store, not to ask questions," they said. Message received. But I couldn't let it go. One night, I decided to stay late. I clocked out as usual, slipped out the front door, then circled back to the alley behind the morgue and hid near the back entrance. Hours passed. The building was silent, save for the occasional creak of the walls settling. Just when I started to question my decision, I heard the rumble of an old freight elevator. Peeking through a side window, I saw two men wheeling covered gurneys out of the elevator and into the storage room. They weren't dressed like paramedics or morgue staff. Their suits were too crisp, their movements too methodical. They entered the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. I crept closer, sticking to the shadows. My heart pounded so loud I was sure it would give me away. The storage room had been transformed. The gurneys were lined up against the walls, their coverings removed to reveal lifeless bodies. A small crowd of people stood around, dressed in expensive suits and elegant dresses. They examined the bodies like livestock at an auction, poking and prodding, murmuring to one another in hushed tones. One man lifted a body's arm, checking its muscle tone, while a woman leaned in close to inspect the skin. "Lot 3, a voice announced. It was the supervisor. They stood at the center of the room, clipboard in hand, their expression cold and detached. 35,000, starting bid. I felt sick. My legs threatened to give out, but I forced myself to stay still. I couldn't be here. I couldn't see this. But before I could move, something caught my eye. My own reflection in a mirrored cabinet across the room. My breath hitched. The supervisor's head snapped toward me. "Looks like we have one more lot tonight," they said, their voice calm but menacing. The crowd turned as one, their eyes locking onto me. I bolted. My feet barely touched the ground as I ran. I could hear footsteps behind me, the thud of boots growing louder with each passing second. I reached the back exit and shoved the door open, sprinting into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I was several blocks away, gasping for breath, my mind racing. I didn't go back to the morgue. I didn't even go back to my apartment. I packed a bag, withdrew all the cash I could, and left town that night. No notice, no goodbyes, just gone. A few days later, I checked the morgue's online scheduling system from a burner phone out of morbid curiosity. My name had been wiped clean from the records, as though I'd never worked there at all. But what truly chilled me was the updated inventory list. Among the new arrivals, there was an unclaimed body labeled only as Lot 24. I don't know how they found my name or what they've planned, but I know one thing. I'll never stop running. They're out there, waiting, and they don't leave loose ends. When I first started working at the morgue, the weirdest thing I expected to deal with was bad lighting and the occasional cockroach. But then there was the guy who always muttered about how this place isn't right or how they're hiding something. At first, I thought he was just another conspiracy nut, but the longer I worked there, the harder it became to ignore him. His complaints started small. Suspicious paperwork, body tags that didn't match the intake records, deliveries that happened after midnight. You know, the kind of stuff you could chalk up to poor management or lazy co-workers. But then he went to the authorities. He didn't tell anyone what he said, but he came into work the next day looking pale enough to join our clientele. "They know I'm on to them," he whispered, his eyes darting around like someone was watching. I told him he should take a break, maybe go on vacation. He laughed like I'd just suggested he try skydiving without a parachute. 2 days later, he didn't show up for his shift. The supervisor told us he had quit without notice. That didn't sit right with me. He was always broke, always complaining about bills, Quitting wasn't an option for him. That night, we got a delivery. A plain black van pulled up to the loading dock around midnight. Two guys I'd never seen before wheeled in a body bag, signed the log, and left without a word. Nothing unusual, except for the way the supervisor hovered nearby, watching like a hawk. "Get this one prepped for storage," the supervisor barked, handing me the clipboard. I rolled my eyes but nodded. It was always the grunt work for me. When I unzipped the bag, my stomach dropped. The face staring back at me was his. His skin was waxy, his lips blue, and his eyes wide open, frozen in an expression of pure terror. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the tray of tools behind me. "What the hell?" I whispered, my voice shaking. I checked the tag. The name wasn't his. It was some generic John Doe nonsense, but it was him. I knew it. The scar on his left eyebrow, the chipped tooth from when he slipped on the stairs last month. It was all there, except now he was dead. My first instinct was to run. But where? To who? The supervisor? He'd probably just give me that same dead-eyed glare he always did and tell me to mind my own business. Instead, I took a deep breath, zipped the bag back up, and wheeled it into the freezer. I told myself I'd deal with it in the morning, maybe call the cops, or, I don't know, a journalist. But when I showed up the next day, the body was gone, erased from the log, like it had never been there. When I asked the supervisor about it, they just shrugged. "Must have been a mix-up," they said, their voice flat and uninterested. I wanted to scream, to grab them by the collar and demand answers. But something about the way they looked at me, like they were daring me to push, made my blood run cold. I nodded and went back to work, pretending everything was fine. The day I quit, I left a note in the locker room. It didn't name names or point fingers, just a warning. "This place isn't right. Get out while you can." A few months later, I read about a raid on the morgue. The authorities uncovered something about falsified records and unregistered bodies. I didn't want to know more. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if the guy was right. Maybe they knew he was on to them. And maybe, one day, they'll realize I know too.